In the middle of the night, somewhere between the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Hormuz, a cargo ship called the Tuska kept moving. Warning after warning came from the most powerful navy in the world. For 6 hours, the crew ignored every single one. Then the USS Spruance fired directly into the ship's engine room. Within minutes, US Marines were rappelling from helicopters, dropping onto the deck of an Iranian vessel in the dead of night. The world woke up to something it had not seen in decades. And what happened next set off a chain of events that no one was fully prepared for. This is not just the story of one ship. This is the story of how the world's most important waterway became the center of a standoff that could reshape global energy, global economics, and the balance of power in the Middle East for years to come. But here is the question no one is asking out loud. If the US just seized an Iranian ship in defiance of a ceasefire and Iran is now calling it piracy and military commands on both sides are going on high alert, where exactly does this end? Let's set the scene. Because to understand what just happened, you need to understand the world these ships were sailing through. For over a decade, the Strait of Hormuz has been described as the most important 21 miles of water on Earth, one narrow corridor connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. About 20% of the world's crude oil passes through it. Natural gas, fuel, industrial supplies, all of it flowing through a choke point barely wide enough for two-lane ship traffic. Iran has always known this. Tehran has always understood that its greatest leverage over the world was not just its military, it was geography. The Islamic Republic sits on the northern shore of that strait, and for years, Tehran made one thing crystal clear. If it ever came down to survival, Iran would use that geography as a weapon. Then, in February of 2026, the United States and Israel launched an air campaign against Iran. Strikes hit military installations, weapons depots, and in one of the most consequential moments of the entire conflict, an Israeli operation ended the life of Iran's supreme leader. The Iranian military responded with missile barrages across the region, and almost immediately, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps did exactly what the world feared. They closed the Strait of Hormuz. Overnight, global energy markets entered a state of shock. Shipping companies began rerouting around the entire Arabian Peninsula. Insurance premiums skyrocketed, oil prices spiked, and more than 20,000 sailors on hundreds of vessels found themselves effectively stranded, unable to move freely through one of the world's most critical trade routes. But what most people don't realize is that even as the bombs fell and the missiles flew, a separate, quieter battle was already beginning. A battle not for territory, not for cities or infrastructure, but for the ocean itself. By March, something interesting began to emerge. Iran, battered by airstrikes and facing economic collapse, started a strange new game. Tehran announced it would allow some ships through the Strait of Hormuz, but not for free. The toll? Over $1 million per vessel. Some ships were paying, some nations were cutting deals. China, Russia, India, Pakistan, all of them negotiating quiet arrangements with Tehran to keep their tankers moving. And Washington was watching every single one of those deals with growing frustration. Because here was the problem. Iran had lost the air war. Its military had been severely degraded. Its supreme leader was gone. But Tehran still controlled the water. And as long as it controlled the water, it still had power. Real, tangible, economic power that affected every nation on Earth. President Trump, never one to wait quietly, responded with 2 words: naval blockade. On April 12, 2026, after a round of negotiations in Islamabad collapsed, Trump announced that the United States military would enforce a blockade of all Iranian ports. No ships going to Iran, no ships coming from Iran. The US Navy would physically stop them. CENTCOM was clear about the timeline. The blockade would begin at 10 in the morning on April 13th. It would apply to any vessel traveling to or from Iranian territory. And it would be enforced, globally. Iran's response was instant and furious. If the US wanted a blockade, Tehran would deliver one too. Iran sealed the Strait of Hormuz again, completely. And this time, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard wasn't just issuing warnings. IRGC speedboats began harassing vessels. Iranian drones appeared over tankers. Reports emerged that sea mines had been placed in the strait's shipping lanes. 2 blockades, 1 waterway. 20% of the world's oil supply completely frozen. The US military wasn't sitting still. Behind the scenes, Marines on the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli were running drills, close-quarters combat training, fast-rope descents from helicopters, boarding operations at night. The footage was posted publicly on CENTCOM's social media, and not by accident. This was a message. Washington wanted Tehran to see exactly what was coming. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit had been in the Middle East for weeks. The 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit was heading from the Indo-Pacific. Guided missile destroyers were repositioned. USS Spruance was moved into operational position near the Gulf of Oman, and intelligence teams began tracking every Iranian-flagged vessel in the region with pinpoint precision. Within days of the blockade's launch, the U.S. military had already forced 23 ships to turn around. Some were Iranian-flagged. Some were commercial vessels bound for Iranian ports. All of them complied, until one of them didn't. This is where things take a serious turn. The Tuska was an Iranian-flagged cargo ship. On the evening of April 18th, it was crossing the Arabian Sea, heading toward the Strait of Hormuz. Its destination, the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas. Under the U.S. blockade, that passage was forbidden. The USS Spruance identified the vessel and issued warnings. The Tuska kept moving. More warnings came. The Tuska kept moving. For 6 hours, the crew of the Tuska refused to comply. CENTCOM later said that American forces issued multiple warnings informing the ship's crew that they were in direct violation of the blockade. The crew ignored every single one. What happened next was unprecedented. The USS Spruance trained its 5-inch Mk-45 naval gun at the Tuska's engine room and fired. The explosion tore through the machinery spaces of the Iranian vessel. The Tuska stopped dead in the water. Marines launched from the USS Tripoli by helicopter. They flew across the dark waters of the Arabian Sea, and in scenes that looked more like a special operations movie than a real-world maritime enforcement action, U.S. Marines rappelled directly onto the deck of the stricken Iranian cargo ship. The Tuska was now in American hands. Trump announced it himself on social media within hours. His tone was unmistakable. The ship had refused every warning, so the Navy had, in his words, stopped them right in their tracks by blowing a hole in the engine room. The Marines now had custody of the vessel, he confirmed. CENTCOM added the official framing. American forces acted in a deliberate, professional, and proportional manner to ensure compliance. But Tehran saw it very differently. Iran's response was swift and scalding. The country's top joint military command, the Khatam al-Anbiya headquarters, called the operation a violation of the ceasefire that had been in place since April 9th. They called it maritime piracy, and they promised retaliation. Let that word sink in. Retaliation. From a nation that had already been at war with the United States for 2 months. From a military that had already fired missiles, deployed drones, and mined critical waterways. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, said it plainly. Striking a commercial vessel and taking its crew hostage is an act of piracy and state terrorism. Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Kalibaf, delivered perhaps the most ominous line of all. In remarks broadcast on Iranian state television, he made the position of Tehran absolutely clear. It is impossible for others to pass through the Strait of Hormuz while we cannot. That single sentence contained everything: a threat, a principle, and a line in the sand. Iran's negotiating team refused to travel to Islamabad for the next round of peace talks. The diplomatic channel, already strained, now appeared to be collapsing entirely. Iran's foreign ministry spokesman told reporters that there were no indications of American seriousness in pursuing diplomacy. And then, in a move that escalated everything to yet another level, Iran responded in kind. 2 foreign cargo ships transiting near the Strait of Hormuz were seized by Iranian forces, one flying the Liberian flag, one flying the flag of Panama. Both were moved to the Iranian coast, tit for tat, ship for ship. The world now had 2 nuclear-adjacent powers seizing each other's vessels on the open ocean, while the most critical oil corridor on the planet remained paralyzed. But this is where the full picture becomes clear and where the stakes become almost impossible to overstate. What most people don't realize is that this wasn't just about the Tuska. The seizure of that single ship was the most visible moment in a much larger operation that the United States had been executing quietly for months. Even before the blockade, American Special Operations Forces had already been operating in the open ocean. In December of 2025, a U.S. Special Operations team had boarded a Chinese-flagged vessel in the Indian Ocean several hundred miles off the coast of Sri Lanka. The ship was carrying missile guidance components, gyroscopes, accelerometers, precision electronics, all bound for Iranian defense industries. The U.S. had tracked the shipment from the moment it left a Chinese port. Intelligence teams had cataloged every item loaded onto that vessel before it ever left the dock. And when it was far enough into international waters, American commandos boarded it and seized the cargo. The seizure was barely reported, but it sent a message that Washington was now willing to operate anywhere on the globe to cut off Iran's weapons supply chains. Now, in April of 2026, that same doctrine was being applied with far more force and far more visibility. The USS Spruance, the Marines rappelling onto the Tuska, the open ocean interdiction of the MT Tafani, an oil supertanker that had loaded at Iran's Kharg Island terminal and was attempting to reach Malaysia, stopped by U.S. forces more than 2,000 miles from the Persian Gulf. The U.S. Department of Defense announced that international waters were not a refuge for sanctioned vessels. The message was being delivered everywhere at once. And the economic consequences were beginning to compound in ways that alarmed analysts worldwide. Consider these numbers carefully. More than 20,000 sailors were stranded on hundreds of ships, unable to move freely through the Gulf. Iran, according to U.S. estimates, was losing $500 million a day from the blockade. By the 1st of May, the Pentagon calculated that Tehran had forfeited nearly $5 billion in oil revenue in just over 2 weeks. 31 oil tankers carrying 53 million barrels of Iranian crude were sitting motionless in the Gulf, going nowhere. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was watching its own energy calculations change in real time. Nations that depended on Gulf oil for their economies were scrambling. India summoned Iran's ambassador. China's foreign ministry called for restraint. European airlines began canceling night flights to the region, anticipating the possibility of further military action. The global oil market, already disrupted since February, was looking at a scenario where the Strait of Hormuz remained closed indefinitely, and where the dual blockade on both sides could feed on itself indefinitely. Because here is what makes this situation different from every previous confrontation in this region. When the U.S. has blockaded nations before, as it did with Cuba and Venezuela, those countries did not have the ability to shut down one of the world's critical oil arteries in retaliation. Iran does. The longer Washington keeps squeezing, the longer Tehran keeps the strait closed. The longer the strait stays closed, the more pain the entire world absorbs. Not just Iran, not just the United States, everyone. That asymmetry is what makes the seizure of the Tuska so dangerous. Because every escalation from America invites an escalation from Iran. And every Iranian escalation draws the United States in deeper. So where does this leave the world? Negotiations are fractured. Iran has now refused to send representatives to the Islamabad talks following the Tuska incident. The ceasefire that had been holding since April 9th is visibly fraying. Military commands on both sides are on heightened alert. Iran's armed forces have promised a response. U.S. forces are conducting live maritime operations daily. And sitting at the center of all of this is a waterway that the entire global economy depends on. The United States military is now committed to a blockade that, by its own admission, is costing Iran hundreds of millions of dollars every single day. But it is also increasingly costing the world. Oil prices, shipping routes, energy supply chains, all of them disrupted. All of them waiting for a resolution that keeps getting further away. Trump has framed the entire operation as leverage. The message from Washington is simple: accept a deal or face economic destruction. The United States loses nothing, he said. Iran loses everything. But Iran has a different calculation. In Tehran's view, surrendering to a naval blockade allowing the United States to seize its ships, board its vessels, dictate which cargo it can move through international waters, would be a humiliation that no Iranian government could survive politically. It would validate every American pressure point, and it would signal to every adversary of Tehran that the Islamic Republic can be broken by economic force alone. So both sides are locked, and every ship on the ocean is now a potential trigger. That is why the capture of the Tuska matters far beyond one cargo ship in the Arabian Sea. Think about what happened in those 6 hours before the USS Spruance fired. An Iranian crew, knowing full well that a guided missile destroyer was tracking them, knowing that the most powerful navy in the world had issued direct warnings, kept sailing anyway. Whether that was defiance, orders from Tehran, or calculated provocation, we may never fully know. But what it produced was the first time in this conflict that an American warship fired on an Iranian commercial vessel. The first time U.S. Marines boarded and seized an Iranian ship under fire conditions. And the first time Iran openly threatened direct retaliation in response to an American maritime action. None of those things can be undone. They are now part of the history of this conflict, part of the escalation ladder that both sides are climbing. And somewhere out on the water right now, there are more ships, more tankers, more Iranian-flagged vessels making calculations about whether to comply with the blockade or test it, more U.S. warships watching those vessels, tracking them, waiting to see what they do. What happens on that water in the coming days and weeks will determine whether this conflict stays in the realm of economic warfare or whether it crosses into something far more dangerous. Here is the final thing worth sitting with. The Strait of Hormuz has never been just a piece of geography. It has always been an idea. The idea that the world's energy supply is vulnerable. That 21 miles of water can hold the global economy hostage. That whoever controls that passage controls something that every major power on Earth needs. For decades, the United States kept that passage open. The American Navy was the guarantor of freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, in the Indian Ocean, and in the waters between them. The entire post-World War II global order was built on the assumption that the seas would remain open. What is happening right now is a direct challenge to that order, from both sides. Iran is using geography as a weapon, and the United States is responding by using military force to override it. The capture of the Tuska was not just a military operation. It was a declaration that the United States will physically enforce the economic isolation of Iran wherever its ships sail, in whatever waters they travel, and that no ceasefire, no diplomatic process, no international legal debate about piracy will stop that enforcement. Iran has made its own declaration that the Strait of Hormuz is not open to a world that is at war with the Islamic Republic, that Iranian sovereignty over those waters is not negotiable, that any nation wishing to pass through will do so on Tehran's terms or not at all. 2 declarations, 1 waterway, and a world holding its breath. The next ship that defies the blockade will tell us everything about where this is heading. Watch closely.